Struggling mechanic creates custom engine from scrap. Next day, Nascar team owner arrives at his shop. 15 years ago, Leroy Hudson stood at the pinnacle of his career, head of engineering at one of the most prestigious teams in NASCAR. His engines didn't just win races, they broke records. But all it took was one refusal, one decision to speak up, one moment of integrity. He warned the team about a fuel system modification that could lead to catastrophic failure in a crash. It wasn't a theory. He had data, simulations, proof, but they didn't want a conscience. They wanted wins. So they buried the report and buried him with it. In a matter of weeks, Leroy went from celebrated innovator to corporate liability. He was fired, blacklisted, and quietly erased from the industry he helped shape. Offers disappeared overnight. His name turned toxic. And when the press came knocking, all they found was a man accused of theft and insubordination, not the one who tried to save lives. Now, in a forgotten town no one talks about unless they're lost on the interstate, Leroy works out of a rusted garage with a sagging roof and an oil-stained sign that still reads, Hudson Auto Repair. Half the bulbs in the overhead lights have long since died, and the space smells of old grease and older regrets. The kind of place where customers don't walk in with questions. They come with desperation, clunking engines, leaking transmissions, and just enough cash to get back on the road. Leroy fixes what he can, charges less than he should, and doesn't ask questions. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and hands permanently stained black, he's a far cry from the man whose engines once roared down Daytona's backstretch at 200 miles an hour. Here, he works in silence. No crowds, no glory, just bolts, wrenches, and bills he can't pay. Every morning starts the same. The hiss of the coffee machine, the creak of the rolling garage door, the buzz of an ancient fluorescent light struggling to flicker on. And every morning, a growing pile of past-due notices greets him on the desk. The bank's final warning sits unopened under a carburetor he's been meaning to rebuild. His tools are older than some of his customers' cars. The heat barely works, and the only thing colder than the concrete floor is the memory of what his life used to be. But behind the weariness, behind the weary eyes and the stitched-up work shirts, there's something else, something that refuses to quit. Every night, long after the last customer has gone and the phone has stopped ringing, Leroy walks to the back of the garage where a tarp covers more than just dust. It's where he's hidden the pieces of his past, literal pieces, salvaged metal, old blueprints, designs he was never allowed to build, schematics for an engine that could change everything, more efficient, more powerful, built not for racetracks, but for real roads, for real people. And he's been quietly collecting what he needs, pulling parts from junkyards, bartering with other mechanics, assembling his dream piece by piece, like a secret puzzle only he knows how to solve. The world forgot Leroy Hudson. The industry moved on, but Leroy didn't. And now, with the bank breathing down his neck, with nothing left to lose and just enough scrap to build something new, he's ready to remind them. Not with lawsuits, not with bitterness, with an engine, one unlike anything they've seen, one built from steel, sweat, and spite. And if it works, if he can make it run, he won't have to beg anyone to listen. They'll come looking for him, and this time they'll remember his name. For most people, junk is just that, junk. Broken parts, rusted steel, discarded scraps left to rot in salvage yards and backlots. But to Leroy Hudson, it was potential, unseen, unpolished, and forgotten by everyone else. But to him, it was a gold mine. He didn't see rust. He saw history, precision, craftsmanship buried under time and corrosion. Where others walked past dented manifolds and stripped crankshafts, Leroy stopped, stared, measured, because he wasn't building something ordinary. He was building the impossible with the improbable, and he was doing it all in secret. Late into the night, after the town had fallen silent and the last delivery truck had rumbled off down Main Street, he'd retreat to the rear of the shop where the world didn't exist. a space cordoned off with tops and tool carts, stacked with half-labeled bins, and piled high with not-so-random junk. This wasn't clutter. This was curated. Every piece had a purpose, even if he didn't know what that purpose was yet. There were piston rods from a retired fighter jet engine he'd bought for $30 from an old contact, valve springs from a 1970s racing bike that had been totaled in '82, a computer from an abandoned hybrid prototype that a dealership mechanic once told him was useless. To Leroy, it was a neural hub waiting to be taught something new. It wasn't madness, it was vision. He'd had it since the days when he was designing high-performance race engines that could squeeze every fraction of horsepower out of fuel like a magician pulling silk scarves from thin air. But even then, he had bigger dreams, beyond the speedways. He wanted to reinvent the way engines worked altogether. Not just more power, not just better efficiency, both at once, all in an engine that could fit into a pickup or a family sedan. He called it the variable compression system, a mechanical symphony of shifting ratios, dynamic valve timing, and a control unit that could think for itself. On paper, it was revolutionary. In the boardroom, it was too ambitious, too experimental, too risky, and eventually too dangerous when he refused to sign off on that fatal modification that ended his career. But the ideas had never left him. He kept them, guarded them, in a collection of old engineering notebooks stained with grease and sweat, pages crinkled from years of handling. Those notebooks were now spread across the workbench like a cartographer's map of unknown territory. Diagrams, formulas, flow charts, all scrawled in the same tight, purposeful handwriting. Some were decades old, others newly revised with the benefit of hindsight and necessity. Because now he wasn't just trying to prove something, he was trying to survive. The bank had given him 3 weeks. The parts suppliers had stopped extending credit. If something didn't change, and fast, Hudson Auto Repair would become the next abandoned storefront on Stonebridge's already struggling main strip. But something was changing. Every night, Leroy worked deeper into his design, test-fitting mismatched parts, machining old components to new specs using makeshift tools. Every mistake was a lesson, every failure a step forward. The engine wasn't just taking shape, it was evolving. What had started as a stack of rough sketches and wild ambition was slowly becoming metal and movement. The core block had been stripped down, cleaned, modified to support the unique head geometry he'd drawn up years ago. A variable chamber system, never built before outside of lab settings, was being hand-fabricated from mismatched alloys, and to his surprise, it was working. There was a moment, just after midnight, one Tuesday, when Leroy stood over the partially assembled engine, fingers black with oil, his breath fogging in the cold air, and felt it. That spark. The one he hadn't felt since the day he ran a dyno test at Wellington Racing and broke a speed record no one thought possible. But this was different. This wasn't just about numbers. This was about meaning, about proving that discarded doesn't mean useless, that forgotten doesn't mean finished, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't either. In those quiet hours, it wasn't just an engine coming back to life. It was him. Every turn of a bolt, every adjustment, every diagram annotated again with new insights, stitched together more than parts. It stitched together his identity, the one they tried to erase, the one he had let fade for too long. And still, no one knew. The town thought of him as the old mechanic who never left. Curtis Pearson assumed he'd given up. The bank counted him out. But behind those tarped-off corners, in the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the clink of tools against steel, a forgotten man was building something extraordinary out of everything the world had thrown away. And if he could make it work, if he could get it to fire, to run, to roar, then maybe, just maybe, they'd have no choice but to remember who Leroy Hudson really was. It started with a shadow through the office blinds. Leroy didn't even look up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. He didn't have to. The slow, deliberate sound of polished boots across the gravel, the faint scent of cologne over engine oil, the practiced jingle of the door. Curtis Pearson never arrived unannounced, but he never needed to. His presence was loud enough. Tall, sharp-featured, and dressed like he ran a dealership instead of a garage, Curtis was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. He didn't fix engines. He bought technicians who did. His business across the street, Pearson's Auto Service, looked like something out of a catalog. Shiny floors, uniforms, corporate branding. But Leroy knew the truth beneath the polish. Curtis sold image, not skill. And what he wanted wasn't competition. It was control. "You know why I'm here," Curtis said, without even pretending otherwise. "The offer still stands, and after what Maurice at the bank told me, I'd say you don't have the luxury of waiting much longer." Leroy didn't respond at first, just wiped his hands on a rag already soaked through with grime and turned to face him. Curtis always picked the worst moments, always appeared when a job was unfinished, or a delivery was late, or Leroy was just tired enough to consider what it might feel like to walk away. "The shop's not for sale," Leroy muttered, his tone final, but Curtis wasn't deterred. "This building's falling apart," Curtis said, circling like a vulture. "You've got a customer base that's evaporating, suppliers who don't answer your calls, and 3 months of missed payments. Come on, Leroy, let it go. You could use the money, retire, relax. Let someone else worry about keeping the lights on." He walked to the window and looked out across the lot, where 2 rusted vehicles sat in silence. "I'd tear it down and turn the whole block into something real. Expand my bays, hire more people, boost the town economy. We both know it's just a matter of time." Leroy's silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, but when he finally spoke, his voice cut sharp. "This shop was my father's. Before that, my grandfather's. I learned to rebuild my first carburetor on that workbench when I was 12. You want to turn that into a parking lot?" Curtis didn't answer. He didn't need to. He turned with a thin smile and said only, "Offer expires at the end of the month," before walking out the door with all the smugness of someone who believed he already owned the place. The door had barely shut behind him when Floyd Watkins walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the look of someone who'd been watching from across the street. "He at it again?" Floyd asked, handing Leroy a cup. "He doesn't quit," Leroy muttered, staring out the same window Curtis had just looked through. "He doesn't have to," Floyd replied. "You're giving him all the ammunition he needs by trying to fight this alone." Leroy sighed and leaned against the counter. "I'm not trying to win some war, Floyd. I'm trying to stay afloat. That man's already running me out of business with shiny paint and cheap fixes, and now the bank's listening to him more than they're listening to me." Floyd sipped his coffee, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "Letter came in this morning from Jessica," he said. "She's finishing up school. Says she's coming home." That made Leroy pause. Jessica, his daughter, his pride, and his reminder of everything he hadn't been able to give her, was graduating, business degree, sharp mind, saw the world in numbers and forecasts, not grease and torque specs. He'd always wondered if she looked at his life and saw a cautionary tale. When her mother died, she'd powered through school like it was a mission. Maybe it was. Maybe she was trying to build the life he couldn't. "She's coming back?" Leroy asked quietly, unfolding the letter. "Says she wants to help out around the shop for a while. Spend time here before heading into the corporate world," Floyd replied. "If you ask me, maybe what this place needs isn't just a new part or a fresh coat of paint. Maybe it needs her eyes, her way of thinking. You've got all the heart in the world, but you can't run on heart alone anymore." That thought stuck with Leroy for the rest of the day. He worked in silence, fixing up a rusted-out Chevy that needed more than it was worth. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the last tools were set back into place, he stood in the doorway of the garage and stared across the street. Pearson's Auto glowed like a showroom, lit from every angle. It was a castle. His shop, by comparison, looked like a relic. But Leroy didn't move, didn't flinch, because what Curtis didn't understand, what he'd never understand, was that this place wasn't about money or image or market share. It was about legacy, about grit, about the people who trusted him because they knew he wouldn't cut corners or push unnecessary repairs. And now, with his daughter coming back and a miracle of an engine beginning to breathe on his workbench, he felt something unfamiliar. Not hope, not yet, but the first hint of a fight still left in him. Curtis could circle all he wanted, but Leroy Hudson wasn't ready to be picked clean. Not yet. Not while there was still one more thing he had left to prove. It was the kind of morning that felt heavier than it looked. The clouds hung low over Stonebridge, pale and unmoving, casting the town in a light that made everything look more tired than usual. Leroy Hudson sat in his office with a stack of unopened bills on one side of the desk and a half-drunk cup of coffee on the other. He wasn't looking at either. His eyes were fixed on the calendar pinned to the corkboard in front of him, where a single date had been circled in red. End of the month. 2 weeks left. The bank had been cleared, one more missed payment, and they'd move forward with foreclosure. And once the bank took the shop, it was over. Not just for him, but for everything tied to this place. His family's name, his daughter's future, and whatever hope he had left of proving he wasn't the washed-up whistleblower everyone had quietly labeled him as. He was still staring at the calendar when the bell above the garage door jingled, followed by the unmistakable voice of Alma Watkins, his best friend's wife and unofficial guardian angel of the entire block. "You look like a man who hasn't had a proper meal in 3 days," she said, setting a heavy paper bag on his desk. "Because I haven't," Leroy muttered, managing a faint smile. Alma gave him a look that landed somewhere between maternal concern and light scolding. "You think clearer when you eat, Leroy, and I don't want to hear any excuses about not being hungry." A minute later, Floyd appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a raised eyebrow. "Bank called again?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Leroy nodded slowly. "This morning. They're done being patient. Friday's the deadline. I told them I had a plan, but I think Maurice could hear the lie in my voice." Floyd didn't say anything at first. He just handed Leroy the coffee and sat down in the old creaky chair across the desk. The silence stretched for a moment, not heavy, just familiar. Then he said, "You know, maybe it's time to stop thinking like a man who's losing a business and start thinking like a man who still has something to build." Leroy looked up at him. "With what? Creditors have cut me off. Curtis is watching me like a hawk. I've got a half-finished engine made from spare parts and good intentions." Floyd leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "That engine, whatever it is you're cooking back there, it's got your fire back. I haven't seen that in you for years, Leroy. You get that thing running, I mean really running. People won't care where it came from. They'll care what it does." The moment was interrupted by the sound of an engine sputtering into the lot. It wasn't Curtis's polished SUV or one of his customers' late-model sedans. It was a battered old pickup, the kind that looked like it had been resurrected more times than it had any right to be. It came to a stop with a mechanical wheeze, and a tall, lanky teenager with oil on his jeans and nervous energy in his steps climbed out. "Excuse me," he said, peering through the open garage door. "Are you Mr. Hudson?" Leroy stepped forward, nodding. "I am. What can I do for you?" The kid held out a hand. "Name's Corey Adams. Sheriff Taylor said you might be able to help me with my truck. It's been knocking something awful, and I took it to Pearson's, but—" He hesitated. "They said the engine's shot. Quoted me $4,000 for a replacement. I don't have that kind of money." Leroy motioned for him to pop the hood. As he leaned over the engine, he could hear it before he even saw it. Valve lash issues, maybe worn rocker arms, but definitely not a blown engine. "How long's it been running like this?" he asked. "Started a few weeks ago," Corey replied. "Got worse last night. I race it sometimes. Not professionally, just at the fairgrounds on weekends. My dad used to race there too, Leonard Adams." That name stopped Leroy cold. He looked up at the kid, really looked at him this time. "Leonard Adams was your father?" "Yes, sir," Corey said. "You knew him?" "We worked together a long time ago," Leroy replied, his voice quiet. "Your dad was one of the best natural mechanics I ever met, had a real instinct for engines." He closed the hood gently. "You don't need a new engine. What you need is a proper valve adjustment and some new rocker arms. I can do it for $600. Should have it done by tomorrow." The relief on Corey's face was immediate and genuine. "That'd be amazing. Thank you, Mr. Hudson." "Just call me Leroy," he said, "and bring it back in the morning. I'll get the parts ordered today." After Corey left, Leroy stood in the garage and stared at the empty space where the truck had been. "Leonard's kid," he said out loud. "Small world," Floyd answered. "Real small," Leroy said, then glanced toward the back of the shop where the engine under the top waited. "And maybe just the right time." He walked over, pulled the tarp back, and stared down at the rough beginnings of the variable compression system he'd been tinkering with in secret. Something stirred inside him, something that felt like momentum, like purpose. He still didn't have the money, still didn't have the parts, still didn't have a plan to keep the bank at bay, but he had a truck to fix, a kid who believed in him, and a design that, if he could make it real, might change everything. Curtis Pearson thought he'd already won, but Curtis didn't know about the pile of notebooks filled with ideas too advanced for their time. He didn't know about the aerospace-grade parts Leroy had quietly salvaged and modified. He didn't know about Jessica coming home. He didn't know that Leroy Hudson was finally ready to stop surviving and start building something that couldn't be ignored. As the sun sank lower and the lights in the garage flickered on one by one, Leroy rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a wrench, and got to work. Because time was running out, and now, at last, so was his patience. The next morning broke cold and grey, the kind of early autumn day that carried a bite in the air and a warning in the wind. Leroy was already in the garage before the first light cut through the haze outside. He hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out of thoughts, calculations, and mechanical diagrams that floated behind his eyelids every time he tried to shut them. He'd made coffee so strong it could strip paint and stood over the workbench, flipping through his old notebooks again like a priest reviewing scripture before Mass. This wasn't about tinkering anymore, not about hope. It was a race against time and failure. One shot to build something that could either save his shop or seal its tomb. By 8:15, Corey Adams was back. The kid had a nervous look on his face and a folder full of questions in his hands, like someone arriving for a job interview they weren't sure they'd get. "Morning, Mr. Hudson," he said, then caught himself. "Leroy." Leroy nodded once, motioned to back the truck in, and before long they had the hood open and the engine exposed like a patient on an operating table. It was a worn block, scarred from neglect and cheap oil, but not dead. Leroy's hands moved automatically, checking clearances, tapping the rocker arms, turning the crank manually. He talked as he worked, explaining each step with a clarity that only came from decades of repetition and heartbreak. "See this wear pattern? That's not failure, it's fatigue. Pearson's crew either didn't bother to look or they didn't know what they were seeing. They tried to sell you a coffin when all you needed was a splint." Corey watched every move, nodding slowly. "My dad used to talk about you," he said after a while. "Said you were the guy who could listen to an engine and tell it what was wrong without even touching it. He said you didn't just fix things, you understood them, like they talked to you." Leroy paused, holding a worn cam follower in his hand. "Your dad had that same instinct. That's what made him special, not just knowing how it worked, but feeling it." As they removed parts and cleaned components, Leroy started pulling from the shelf behind the workbench. This wasn't off-the-shelf stuff. It was a curated selection of salvage, the kind of inventory most would overlook as junk. But to Leroy, each piece had potential. He'd spent years rescuing parts like these from scrap heaps, restoring them, cataloging them in his head like rare books in a forgotten library. Rocker arms from a '93 Ford F-150, valve covers from a wrecked Impala, springs from an experimental two-stroke engine built by a friend who'd since retired to Florida. None of it matched on paper, but Leroy knew it would work. He didn't need brand new. He needed functional, durable, smart. Corey kept asking questions about compression, valve timing, oil pressure, and Leroy kept answering, not like a teacher lecturing a student, but like a mentor guiding someone who might just be worth investing in. The hours passed quickly, filled with mechanical rhythm and the quiet language spoken between people who care deeply about something most others overlook. By early afternoon, they had the new parts installed, clearances set, fluids topped. The truck was whole again, ready to breathe. When Leroy turned the key, the engine coughed, sputtered, then settled into a smooth idle. The knock was gone. The rhythm was clean. Corey's face lit up like he'd just won his first race. "It's never sounded this good," he said, nearly laughing from relief. "Feels like I've got a new truck under the same old hood." Leroy didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth shifted slightly, the closest he got to showing pride these days. "Just needed someone to listen to what it was really asking for," he said, as Corey drove off, promising to return with payment and maybe even some help around the garage in exchange for what he couldn't afford up front. Leroy stood outside, arms folded. It wasn't just about fixing a truck. It was about remembering what he was good at and who he could still be. Then Floyd showed up again, this time with news. "Jessica called," he said. "She's already in town. She's on her way here." That stopped Leroy in his tracks. "She's early," he muttered, not sure if he felt nervous or excited or something in between. 10 minutes later, her car rolled into the gravel lot, and out stepped Jessica Hudson, 24 years old, sharp as a tack, polished like the degree she'd just earned, but still carrying that same no-nonsense expression she'd had since she was 12, and demanding to know why oil smelled like burnt toast. She walked straight up to him, no hesitation. "Hi, Dad." "Hey, kid," Leroy replied, and that was all they needed for the first moment. She looked around the garage, taking it in with eyes that now saw numbers and business models behind every rack of tools and unpaid invoice. "You didn't tell me it was this bad," she said, holding up a statement from the pile on the desk. "I didn't want you worrying while you were finishing school," Leroy replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Jessica sighed, softer than expected. "Well, I'm properly worried now." But worry wasn't the only thing in her eyes. There was purpose, calculation, and maybe just enough faith in what they could still do, if they did it together. She walked over to the back of the shop and pulled aside the tarp covering the mystery engine project. "Is this what I think it is?" Leroy nodded. "The variable compression system, or the start of it?" Jessica stared down at the engine, then back at her father. "Let's make a plan," she said, "and this time you're not doing it alone." Leroy swallowed hard, emotion rising quietly. "You sure you want to be part of this mess?" She gave him the faintest smile. "It's not a mess, it's a comeback." And with that, a new chapter began, not just for the engine, but for the Hudson family, the garage, and a future that might still be salvageable after all. Leroy stood in the back of the garage, staring at the engine block like it was a puzzle he hadn't solved in time. The knock on Corey's truck was gone, sure, and that job was paid for, which helped with the lights and maybe part of payroll. But the real problem, the one that lived on the calendar and ticked down with every hour, was still unsolved. Friday wasn't getting any farther away. The bank's patience was gone. Curtis Pearson, smug as ever, had stopped by again that morning, making the same offer he always did: sell out, walk away, pretend the last 40 years of his life could be written off with a handshake and a signature. Leroy hadn't even bothered to answer the door this time. Instead, he went to the back, grabbed his notebook off the shelf, and pulled the tarp all the way off the engine. It wasn't much to look at yet. Just a cluster of parts bolted to a stripped-down block, half assembled and half theorized. But it was more than potential. It was purpose. He ran his hands across the metal surface, brushing off flecks of dust and old grease, feeling the ridges and bolts and machined edges the way a painter might trace the canvas before the first stroke. This was the idea that had gotten him blacklisted, This was the design that had cost him everything. But now, stripped of industry polish, working with little more than salvage and instinct, he finally had the freedom to build it the way he always meant to. Jessica watched him from the doorway for a moment before stepping in. "You really think you can finish it?" she asked. Not doubting, just doing the math. Leroy nodded slowly. "I've had 15 years to think about it. I know every flaw in the original layout, every line of resistance from Wellington's board, every shortcut they pushed. This engine can work, Jess. I've just never had the chance to prove it." She walked over, picked up one of his hand-drawn diagrams, and studied the mix of equations and sketches. "You're not trying to make a race engine anymore," she said. "You're trying to build something for everyday cars. But with racing performance, that's what this is, isn't it?" Leroy's eyes lit up. "Exactly. Variable compression that adjusts dynamically to load and demand. High performance when you want it. High efficiency when you don't. Same block, same footprint, but smarter." Jessica tapped her fingers on the edge of the workbench. "Okay, let's say you get it running. Then what? You think some investor's going to stroll through Stonebridge and hand you a check?" Leroy's face didn't change. "Number." "But there's the Inventors Showcase in 3 weeks, at the county fairgrounds. Top prize is $15,000, and I've already registered." That caught her off guard. "You already signed up?" He nodded. 2 months ago. Figured I'd either be ready or I wouldn't, but I wasn't going to let the deadline pass me without trying." Jessica exhaled, then pulled a pen from behind her ear and started scribbling on a pad. 3 weeks. That means we need a timeline, milestones, daily objectives, and a contingency for each critical component. Also a budget, but I assume we're broke. Leroy didn't even blink. "Pretty much," she smiled faintly. "Then we get creative." They spent the rest of the day reorganizing the shop. Jessica cleared the clutter from the office and turned it into a command center, setting up a whiteboard with sections labeled Design, Fabrication, Testing, and Presentation. She even dusted off an old laptop, syncing it with her phone so she could coordinate everything in the cloud. Meanwhile, Leroy moved everything related to the engine project into one section of the garage. No more scattered parts, no more notes on napkins. If this was going to work, it had to be run like a real operation. By evening, Floyd stopped by with dinner from Alma, chili, cornbread, and a note that simply read, "You've got 3 weeks. Don't waste them." As they sat around the folding table, Jessica pulled out her tablet and projected a simple calendar onto the wall. "Here's the plan," she said. "Week 1, full component inventory and primary system assembly. Week 2, electronic integration and baseline testing. Week 3, calibration, documentation, and showcase prep." Floyd looked impressed. "Didn't realize you got a degree in strategy and miracles," Jessica smirked. "Business administration, but same thing right now." Later, after Floyd had left and Jessica was finishing the first draft of a press release, for after they won, not before, Leroy lingered by the engine again. He looked at the way the light hit the metal, the way the lines and parts finally started to take shape. He could see it, even if no one else could yet. The movement, the flow, the way the engine would breathe under pressure, adjust like a living thing, optimize itself like a racehorse shifting stride mid-run. It wouldn't just work, it would change the way small garages, local mechanics, and the whole damn industry thought about innovation. No boardrooms, no compromise, just results. And in that moment, with the hum of Jessica's keyboard in the background and the smell of Alma's chili still in the air, Leroy Hudson didn't feel like a man on the verge of losing everything. He felt like a man who had something no one else did, a second chance, not to reclaim the past, but to prove once and for all that what had been discarded wasn't broken. It had just been waiting for the right hands to rebuild it. The following morning broke with a quiet kind of purpose. The sky over Stonebridge was a faded steel blue, the kind of cold light that made every surface look sharp and unfinished. Leroy stood at the workbench, staring at a stripped-down camshaft, his fingers tracing the worn lobes as if trying to read the history buried in its metal. He hadn't said much since they'd gone over the plan last night. Jessica had laid it all out, timelines, milestones, dependencies. But today wasn't about the boardroom version of the project. Today was about beginning the actual build. They needed parts, and not just any parts. Components capable of tolerating high compression loads, thermal expansion, micro-tolerances that couldn't be faked. And they didn't have the money to buy new. Leroy knew where to go. Jessica didn't even question it when he said the name, Dominguez Salvage, a scrapyard on the southern edge of town that looked like something out of a forgotten century. 5 acres of rusting skeletons and metal grave markers, owned by a man who understood the value in things others threw away. So they closed up the shop, grabbed the truck, and headed south, Leroy driving with his hands tense on the wheel, Jessica riding shotgun with a checklist on her lap, and the kind of focused silence that only comes from pressure. Ramon Dominguez was already waiting when they arrived, standing beside a stack of transmissions like they were bricks in a fortress wall. He didn't smile, but his eyes were warm, and he extended a hand without words. "Heard you were coming," he said simply. "The old man finally building it?" Leroy nodded. "After all these years." Ramon just grunted and motioned for them to follow. "I've got the corner ready." The southeast edge of the yard wasn't marked on any map, but Leroy had known it well for years. It was where all the oddities ended up. The cast-offs that didn't fit standard makes and models, prototypes, imports, commercial blocks, everything that didn't quite belong but might someday matter. Most people saw scrap. Leroy saw inventory. Every time he'd stopped by over the years, he'd pulled something strange, something promising, and asked Ramon to keep it aside. "Just in case," he'd say. Ramon never asked why. Now, standing at the chain-link gate to that forgotten corner, Jessica looked around and understood. It wasn't just a pile of parts. It was a vision, a blueprint built from metal instead of ink. Ramon unlocked the gate and swung it open. "Help yourself," he said. "What's here is yours." Jessica walked slowly among the tarped piles, peeling back layers of plastic to reveal components that gleamed beneath the dust. A crate of connecting rods sorted by length and bore, a stack of cylinder heads, some pitted, others pristine, specialty valve springs wrapped in oilcloth. This is incredible," she said, glancing at her father. "You've been collecting for how long?" Leroy shrugged. 15 years. Never knew if I'd get to use any of it. Just couldn't throw the idea away." They spent the entire day in that corner of the yard. Leroy picked each part with the precision of a surgeon, checking tolerances, comparing measurements against his notes. Jessica catalogued everything, labeling with tape and scribbling down codes. Even Ramon got in on the work, guiding the forklift, helping load pallets onto the truck, offering occasional commentary in his gruff, economic way. As the afternoon wore on, the truck bed filled with the foundation of a miracle, an engine that didn't exist yet, built from scraps that weren't supposed to matter. Over sandwiches and old thermos coffee in the shade of a stripped-out school bus, Jessica finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind since they arrived. "What exactly makes this engine different?" Leroy looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and paused before answering. "It adapts," he said. "The compression ratio adjusts in real time based on what the engine needs. It can be aggressive when you're pushing it, or gentle when you're cruising. Most engines are a compromise. You pick one ratio, and you live with the trade-offs. Mine doesn't compromise. It thinks." Jessica blinked, caught off guard. "But how does it think? With sensors?" "Partly," Leroy said. "But it's mechanical too. A secondary chamber that regulates pressure. A modified valve system that responds to load. It's not just software controlling a rigid mechanism, it's a feedback loop, a conversation between the engine and itself." She stared at him for a long moment. "That's not just smart, that's revolutionary." Leroy didn't answer. He didn't need to, because that was the dream all along, not to build something flashy or fast or futuristic, but to create an engine that understood what it was doing, something efficient, elegant, uncompromised. By the time they returned to the garage that evening, the truck bed loaded with the building blocks of something unheard of, they were both exhausted but wired. Floyd met them at the door, took one look at the truck, and whistled. "Looks like Christmas came early." Leroy just nodded. "Unpack what we can tonight. Start the mock-up in the morning." Inside, the garage smelled like oil, dust, and possibilities. Jessica looked around at the whiteboard, the scattered tools, the engine stand waiting in the center of the room like a stage before curtain. She could feel it now, the momentum, the quiet thunder building. They weren't just trying to save the garage anymore. They were building something with the power to change the way people thought about engines, about waste, about what could be created from the discarded. As they unloaded the parts and sorted them onto racks and work tables, Jessica turned to her father. "You know this isn't going to be easy." "Never expected it to be," Leroy replied. She nodded. "Then let's get to work." By the time the sun rose over Stonebridge the next morning, the garage wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was a war room. Every tool, every component, every inch of space was now organized around one single objective: building the prototype in time. Leroy stood at the center, eyes scanning the whiteboard Jessica had filled with color-coded deadlines and notes, while the early light from the high windows made the freshly cleared floor gleam like a promise. Despite the exhaustion hanging under his eyes, his movements were sharp, deliberate. He'd always worked best under pressure, but this wasn't just a challenge of engineering, it was a countdown to survival. Jessica arrived with 2 travel mugs of coffee and a stack of printed schedules. "We've got 10 working days before the showcase," she said without preamble. "That's including weekends and assuming we don't hit any major delays. Today, we map out every subsystem: fuel, compression, ignition, control, and identify what we can start fabricating right away. I've also added a column for parts we still need to source. And I posted a help request on the community board. Volunteer mechanics, machinists, anyone with a technical background. Not a lot of responses yet, but we'll take what we can get." Leroy nodded, already flipping through a pile of his design notebooks, dog-eared and stained from years of use. "We start with the compression system. It's the backbone. Everything else connects to it. Fuel delivery, timing, exhaust scavenging. If we can't get that part right, the rest doesn't matter." He motioned for Corey, who had arrived early in his beat-up truck and was now standing near the parts shelves, eager but slightly unsure of his place. "You up for some cutting and fitting today?" Corey grinned. "Absolutely, Mr. Hudson. Whatever you need." "Good," Leroy replied. "We're going to test the variable compression housing using the old hydraulic bench in the back. Start pulling the parts I flagged yesterday. You'll know them by the tags. Blue tape, handwritten specs." While Corey worked to set up the test station, Leroy moved to the assembly table where Luis Vega, Ramon's nephew, had just arrived. Luis had quit his job at Curtis Pearson's garage 2 days earlier, after refusing to install faulty parts on a customer vehicle. Now, armed with a degree in automotive systems and years of practical experience, he was eager for something real, something honest. "Mr. Hudson," he said, offering a schematic he'd been refining at home, "I adjusted your ECU design to simplify the signal routing. If we go with an analog to digital loop here instead of a linear conversion, we can reduce latency and avoid the interference problem." Leroy studied the printout, impressed. "This is solid work, Luis. Get it implemented in the test unit. We'll need diagnostic feedback on the next run." Meanwhile, Norman Buchanan, the weathered farm machinery specialist, rolled in with a portable lathe and a crate of machining tools. His workshop was across town, but he'd offered to bring whatever he could to keep the work centralized. "You've got parts that need custom threading or resizing. You send them to me. No sense wasting time on shipping or outsourcing," he said, already pulling on his work gloves. "I'll set up by the back wall." Jessica stepped in, coordinating every movement with practiced precision, handing off tasks, updating the whiteboard, checking on lunch delivery, chilly again from Alma, who had taken it upon herself to keep them fed until the job was done. Everyone had a role, a task, a corner of the garage that hummed with focused intensity. Even Floyd, who wasn't a mechanic by trade, handled tools and swept workspaces with the kind of pride that made him feel like part of something bigger. By mid-afternoon, the compression chamber prototype was taking shape. Built from a combination of salvaged cast aluminum and machined steel, it was crude, ugly even. But when Leroy fitted the adjustable sleeve and locked it into place with a ratcheting wrench, it held firm. "Start the test cycle," he said. Corey nodded and hit the switch. The bench compressor whirred to life, forcing pressure into the chamber while Luis monitored the output readings on a battered laptop. "Baseline compression, 8.5 to 1, Luis called out. "Activating secondary actuator." The chamber shifted, the internal sleeve rotating with a satisfying mechanical click. "Compression now at 10.1 to 1, holding stable." Leroy smiled, not wide, but deep. This wasn't just proof of concept, it was validation. Outside, the autumn light was starting to fade when Alma arrived with pie. The garage smelled of oil and hot metal, but the scent of cinnamon and sugar cut through it like a reminder of the world beyond gears and grinding. The team gathered at the folding table, plates balanced on laps, eyes tired but bright with something stronger than caffeine, momentum. "This thing," Corey said between bites, "it's going to change everything, isn't it?" Leroy looked at the young man across the table, then around at the mismatched crew around him. Volunteers, friends, family. "It already is," he said. And it was true, because in a garage that had once been just another failing business on the edge of town, something was happening. Not just an invention, not just a mechanical breakthrough, but a gathering, a purpose. And somewhere beyond the grinding noise of Curtis Pearson's polished shop across town, beyond the ticking clock and the looming debt, something deeper had taken root. Belief, not just in the engine, but in each other. The night was heavy with silence, but inside the garage, the air buzzed with the soft symphony of progress. Wrenches turning, grinders whirring, the occasional clatter of metal on concrete when fatigue made hands clumsy. It was the 9th night since they'd started the full build, and sleep had become a luxury no one talked about. The work had grown more complicated. Now it wasn't just about piecing parts together. It was about debugging systems, rebalancing tolerances, making sure every wire, bolt, and seal performed exactly as intended. The engine had taken shape, solid, strange, beautiful in the way only machines built from pure intention can be. But they all knew it wasn't enough to look right. It had to run. It had to prove itself. That evening, a problem had surfaced. The electronic control unit, Luis's domain, was behaving erratically. Not always, but just enough to raise alarms. Intermittent signal loss, slight but undeniable lag in throttle response during bench simulations. On a standard engine, it might go unnoticed. On a system designed to adjust its own compression ratios in real time, it could spell disaster. "It's interference," Luis muttered, hunched over the diagnostic laptop, sweat dotting his forehead. "We're getting electromagnetic bleed from the ignition coil. It's contaminating the control signals. This setup was fine in testing. I don't understand." "Can we shield it?" Leroy asked, already knowing the answer. Luis shook his head. "Not with what we've got. We'd need better isolation, and we're out of insulated housings. The feedback loop's too sensitive." Jessica stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes tracking everything. She wasn't an engineer, but she'd been listening, learning. She stepped forward slowly. "What if you redesigned the ECU to work inside a control window instead of managing every variable directly?" Luis blinked. "Like a range, not a fixed point." She nodded. "My thesis was about adaptive systems. Sometimes it's not about full control. It's about setting boundaries and letting the system regulate itself inside them. If we stop trying to command every parameter and start giving it room to respond naturally." Luis turned back to the laptop, fingers already moving. "That could work. I can adjust the control architecture, create a buffer between the input and output layers. Simplify the real-time logic by focusing on trend behaviors, not exact values. It'll buy us stability." "How long?" Leroy asked. "Overnight, if I have help," Luis said. "But we'll need better components. What we've got won't hold up." Norman scratched his beard. "There's a guy, Howard Ross, teaches electronics at the community college. Owes me for fixing his tractor last spring. He's a wizard with circuitry." "Call him," Jessica said. "Now." An hour later, Howard Ross stood at the control bench, squinting through wire-rimmed glasses at the schematic Luis had drawn. He didn't say much at first, just made a low sound in his throat, the kind that meant his brain was already 5 steps ahead. "I can rebuild this," he finally said, "but I'll need parts, capacitors, signal isolators, shielding tape. Let me make a few calls." True to his word, within 90 minutes, Howard was back, this time with 2 of his best students and a tackle box of parts that looked like they'd come from a mad scientist's basement. While Luis and Howard reworked the control unit from scratch, the rest of the team focused on everything else. Corey helped Norman with the intake manifold, making precision adjustments to the runners using an old milling tool. Jessica finalized the presentation materials, charts, slides, diagrams, to be printed at the county library first thing in the morning. Floyd ran supply checks and coordinated food runs, bringing back burgers and coffee just after midnight. By 3 a.m., the new ECU was complete. Howard ran a dry test. Signals clean, no noise, system responses within 1 millisecond. It's stable. Luis slumped back in his chair, exhausted but grinning. "That's faster than anything I've built before." "Thank Jessica," Howard said, raising an eyebrow. "That adaptive control idea? Brilliant." She looked at her father, who had been watching the entire process from the corner of the room. "You okay?" "Just thinking," Leroy said, "about how I used to try to solve everything myself. Thought if I didn't do it alone, it didn't count. Guess I was wrong." Jessica smiled. "No one builds anything real alone." They decided to wait until daylight for the full system test. Everyone was running on fumes. The risk of pushing too far and making a mistake was too high. So they cleaned up, secured the garage, and slept in shifts. Leroy got 3 hours on the old couch. Jessica curled up on a padded workbench wrapped in a mechanic's jacket. Floyd took the first watch, thermos of coffee in hand, stationed by the front window. Outside, Stonebridge slept under a quilt of fog. But inside that garage, something was coming to life, an engine made from scraps, sweat, and unshakable belief. They were close now, close enough to feel the pressure, close enough to hear the whisper of failure around every corner, but also close enough to see what it could mean. Redemption, proof, maybe even legacy, not just for Leroy, but for every hand that had touched this machine. The countdown wasn't just about the inventor's showcase anymore. It was about everything they stood for, and tomorrow the engine would speak for itself. The morning arrived with a biting wind that swept through Stonebridge like a whispered warning, but no one at the fairgrounds seemed to notice. All eyes, all minds, all breath held tight in collective anticipation. This was the day everything would be decided. The showcase grounds had already begun to stir before dawn. Volunteers setting up booths, exhibitors fine-tuning last-minute details, the scent of hot coffee mingling with the metallic tang of tools and machines. But it was booth 17 that drew the early crowd, and not just out of curiosity. People had heard the whispers, read the local papers, watched the TV spots. A revolutionary engine, built not in a lab or corporate R&D facility, but in a run-down garage on the edge of town. The impossible, somehow, was happening, and everyone wanted to see if it was real. Leroy Hudson stood before his creation, shoulders square, heart pounding with the quiet rhythm of purpose. 15 years of exile, of being ignored, ridiculed, forgotten. He'd carried it all in silence, letting the weight of his ideas bear down until the only thing left to do was act. Now the engine sat gleaming under the fairground lights, its surface polished smooth, the welded seams and raw components somehow more honest than any chrome-plated prototype around them. It looked like what it was, a machine built with hands, hope, and hard-earned wisdom. Jessica moved beside him, checking the presentation boards one last time, adjusting the monitor displaying efficiency simulations, compression schematics, and side-by-side comparisons against industry-standard engines. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had transformed from a daughter watching her father work to the partner who had helped him reclaim his legacy. By 9 a.m., the exhibition was in full swing. Judges moved from display to display with measured interest. Flashy gadgets and sleek consumer tech drew applause from the general public. But among the panel of evaluators, there was something different in the way they approached the Hudson display. Respect, maybe even a hint of skepticism born from not wanting to be taken in by small-town sentiment. But that wariness began to fade the moment the engine came to life. Corey stood ready by the control station. Luis monitored the telemetry feeds. Norman checked the pressure levels, double and triple checked every mount and sensor. At Leroy's nod, Corey flipped the ignition switch. The engine turned once, then again, then caught with a low, throaty hum, not the ragged growl of a salvaged Frankenstein motor, but a steady, tempered purr, the kind of sound that made real mechanics glance up and nod without realizing. The crowd quieted as the display lit up, showing real-time feedback, RPM, torque curves, temperature, fuel efficiency. Leroy moved through the demonstration with the grace of someone not trying to sell anything, but simply explain what he believed in. "This is a variable compression engine," he said, his voice level, each word deliberate. "It adjusts its compression ratio dynamically, based on demand and conditions. The result is better power under load, better efficiency at idle, and lower emissions at every stage." One of the judges leaned in. "And this isn't theoretical? You're claiming this works with scavenged parts?" Jessica stepped forward. "The concept has existed in theory for decades. Our design simplifies the execution, fewer moving components, modular architecture, and the ability to retrofit into existing engine blocks. What you see here was built using salvaged aluminum, aerospace-grade connecting rods from a racing supplier, and a hybrid electronic control unit developed in-house. This isn't just viable, it's scalable." The judges asked more, deep technical questions about pressure differentials, thermodynamic stability, long-term reliability. Leroy answered each without pause. Luis jumped in when the conversation turned digital. Jessica fielded the business questions with practiced clarity, laying out a roadmap for licensing, production partnerships, and potential implementation in agriculture and freight fleets where fuel cost reductions could create huge ripple effects. As they spoke, more onlookers gathered, among them reporters, engineers, skeptics turned silent believers. Then, at the edge of the crowd, Edward Wellington arrived. He didn't speak, didn't make a scene, just stood quietly in a tailored coat, arms folded, watching. Leroy saw him and hesitated for only a heartbeat. That old weight, the betrayal, the accusations, the years of doubt, rose in his chest like smoke. But instead of faltering, he simply turned back to the judges and adjusted the throttle. The engine roared slightly higher. Compression shifted from 8.2 to 10.7 to 1 in real time. No knocking, no stutter. Smooth as a song. "We don't have millions in venture capital," Leroy said, almost to himself but loud enough for all to hear. "We didn't build this in a lab. We built it because we believed it needed to exist, and now it does." Silence followed, not awkward but full, thick with understanding. The kind of silence people remember when something meaningful has been said. The judges moved on, but not before marking notes. Long, thoughtful notes, and one of them giving a slight nod that Leroy couldn't help but notice. Later, backstage before the awards, Jessica sat beside her father on a bench made from pallets. "No matter what happens," she said, "you did it. You proved it works." "We did it," Leroy replied, "but it's not done yet." She smiled. "It never is." When they announced the finalists, the Hudson engine was one of the last names called. Cheers erupted from the Stonebridge contingent in the back, locals who had driven in just to watch, to support. Curtis Pearson wasn't there. Whether out of shame or denial, he had stayed away. But the absence said more than any confrontation could have. Then came the awards. Third place went to a clean water filtration system built by university students. Second went to a modular farming drone. And first went to a machine born in a forgotten garage, pieced together with junkyard parts and stubborn dreams. As the applause washed over them, Leroy didn't smile like a man who'd won something. He stood like someone who'd remembered who he was. Jessica stepped forward to accept the award with him, and together, father and daughter lifted the plaque. Not as a trophy, but as a statement. This engine wasn't the end of the road, it was the start of something. Back in Stonebridge, the garage would still need repairs. The loan still needed renegotiation. Life wouldn't magically transform, but something had shifted. A tide had turned. And as they packed the engine for the drive home, carefully like it was gold, one thing became clear. The world would hear about the Hudson engine. The big companies would come calling. There would be offers, some honest, some not. But they would be ready. Because sometimes the most powerful innovations don't come from billion-dollar labs. They come from battered notebooks, late nights, and a group of people who refused to quit. And in a small town where no one was supposed to make anything new, they had done the unthinkable. They had built a miracle.